Tom, the next question revolves around something that I recalled that was kind of a revelation to me at the time when we discussed it. And that is that you talk of the big cheese in your My Big Toe books. You mentioned that the big cheese also needs a virtual reality, and the LCS needs a virtual reality. That was something that I had not picked up from the books or even thought about. Those virtual realities are something that is needed for the big cheese to operate in certain, of course, much different constraints than we have here. But could you speak a little bit to that? I thought it was so interesting.
Well, yes, the key idea here is that if you are in a, I'll call it space with quotes around it, if you're in a space in which you can have experience, then you are in a virtual reality. A virtual reality is defined by rules. And the meaning of your experience, the context of your experience, is a reflection of those rules. So here in this virtual reality we call the physical universe, the context of our rules is the science here. It's how things work. That's kind of the context. So I run and I jump, but I don't go very high. I only go maybe lucky a couple of feet up in the air. But, and I land, and all that has to do, what happens, the experience I have is, the context of it is limited by the rule set. So any being that is experiencing must have a context for that experience. What does that experience mean? What's the significance of it? There needs to be a context for it. And you'll recall that I say that the very first virtual reality was when the LCS came up with communication protocols, so that all those little individuated units of consciousness could talk to each other and could talk to the larger conscious system. But they needed some kind of virtual reality. And that means a rule set to do that. What's the syntax? What's the vocabulary? What's, in terms of our own language, what's nouns, what's adjectives? You have to have all of that in order to have a conversation. So somehow those rules had to be invented such that the conversations could take place. And that means there's a virtual reality created. Now, speaking of creating virtual realities, we are a piece of consciousness, and we can create a virtual reality. And like you say, that's part of what Tom's Park is about, to encourage people to create their own virtual reality. And the Tom's Park that I've described is just a starting place. But from there, they can have all kinds of other adventures and excursions and have a great conversation with their horse. They can do all kinds of things, and the system will support that. So it's not that they're making up what the horse says. They're not. That is a data stream that's coming to them from the larger consciousness system. That is what the horse is saying. It's not that they're making it up, but they've created the context in which that virtual reality can move forward, which they can have experience within that. Now, I don't mean that they control everything that happens there. They don't. The horse speaks for itself. The horse is a data stream in the body of a horse, but it's a very intelligent horse, and they're really talking to, the larger consciousness system or some part of the larger consciousness system. We ourselves are a part of the larger consciousness system. So you see, context is important for experience, because without context, what does the experience mean? There's no meaning or significance to the experience unless there's some context to give it. So that's why, yes, the big cheese has experience. It has to interact within a virtual reality. And the larger consciousness system also has experience, and it has to live within a virtual reality. Now, it can make its own virtual reality, just like you do in Tom's Park. it can create that virtual reality, and in there it can produce rules and so on, like always observe the sanctity of free will. There's a rule. So now it would act within that rule. That rule then becomes part of the rule set of the virtual reality. So you can have virtual realities inside virtual realities that are inside virtual realities. There's nothing wrong with virtual realities being nested one in the other. So that's, I think, the kind of the answer to what's going on there. Yes, virtual reality is necessary for experience. Experience is necessary to make choices. Choices are necessary to evolve. So that's kind of the
Yeah,
hierarchy.
I know. I remember you saying the larger consciousness system. I guess the first virtual reality was the chat room. And for the big cheese, this is we're talking about a simple hierarchy of management within the system. That big cheese has to work within a certain system, smaller system of the many other systems that there are, and keep track of that. So within that calculation space, it's keeping track of what is going on in these other little virtual realities that are
Mm-hmm.
connected to it. I found that very interesting. And I know you mentioned in one of your interviews with Jeffrey Mishlove that outside of, there's nothing outside of time and space, there's just consciousness. So within a place to experience, there has to be a virtual reality.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's,
Experience without context is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. It's the rules of the virtual reality that create the context that gives meaning
this
to
is
the
the
experience.
place where time is important. There can't be an experience or anything recorded without a virtual reality.
Yeah,
So,
without time. Yeah,
yeah,
before the experience and after the
yeah,
experience. You
yeah,
can't have an experience without time. You can't learn, grow, or evolve without time. Time is a very fundamental part of this reality, and it comes with consciousness because consciousness is awareness with a choice. And if it has a choice, then there must be time before the
yeah,
choice and after the choice. So time is implicit within the logic of consciousness. Time, free will, and consciousness are all
yeah,
necessary for each other. They're all parts of the same thing. When you talk about consciousness, then you have to also allow free will and time as part of what you're talking about, because they all come together. And then we have experience within that space whenever we have basically rules. Now, I talk about the very first element, the simplest form of consciousness was something that just could be in, state one or state two or state A or state B. Well, that's now an awareness, okay, and it can be in, one of two states. So what's the rule set within its working? The rule set is one of two things. That's it. That's the rule set. There are two things there, and you can choose to be in one of them or the other, but not both. So that's the rule set. And that rule set then allows choice. And that's the simplest set of choice and consciousness that you can get. You can't get a choice any simpler than that. So see how those all have to occur together. You have to have that rule set that defines what can be done. And then, so that's the simplest, most irreducible piece of
yeah.
consciousness is just that awareness that it can be in a binary state of 0 or 1 or A or B or something.
That was that
So
consciousness where that consciousness being became more aware of its need for experience and diversity. That's how the first chat room was developed.
ended up,
There wasn't a
yeah,
lot of feedback from that. So then another calculation space was created for more instant feedback and more diverse experiences. It's very interesting how all of that as you lay out in your theory how all of that must have happened, and the reason for it too. I think, well, was really fascinating. It puts a perspective on your metaphor for a system that's not a supernatural system, it's a natural system and a finite system, and how that need for lowering entropy to maintain itself is accomplished with those virtual realities. That was an eye opener. I guess it's a hard enough concept that I first grappled with the virtual reality, and that made sense. But all of the logical derivations that you created of how that may have come to be was really interesting to me.
Yeah, well, the important part of that is that it couldn't come to be any other way. That's the only way that you end up with a consciousness system. And
Right.
it's just evolving by lowering its entropy like everything else that's evolving. It requires time, it requires choice and free will. It
Yeah.
evolves, and as it evolves, it gets more and more complex and more nuanced and more information. And it just keeps evolving until it's the huge, extremely complex consciousness system that we talk about, but it had to start somewhere. And that's then where it starts.
Thank you so much. That's another aspect of the virtual reality that
Yeah.
I think we should revisit for newer audiences.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, it's, if you think about these things in a very fundamental way, they tend to be very abstract. And it takes a long time to wrap your mind around abstractions.
Yeah.
We here in this virtual reality are used to things being physical. And it's real easy to wrap your mind around a piece of wood. It just is, and it's there. And, it does what wood does. So that's different. But when you get to something that is what we would call, or what psychologists would call, not concrete, we deal with the concrete world, and then we deal with abstractions. And the abstractions are always difficult. And typically, to express the abstractions, we tend to make up metaphors that are more concrete so that people can deal with concrete things. We make up metaphors like the chakras.
Yeah.
So that takes a very abstract principle, about consciousness and growing and evolving consciousness, and it breaks it into 7 big chunks. And with each one of those chunks, there's another bunch of sub-chunks in there that are the attributes of that. And we make up this model just so people can deal with something more concrete, something they can see, because you can see that. It's not that becomes an invisible thing, just an idea. Thousands of people, I'm one of them, can see chakras. It's like seeing auras. Auras are not fundamental either. It's another one of those metaphoric concepts we make. And of course, eventually enough people get involved in it, and you got a collective consciousness that defines those things. And that's part then of our culture. And they become quite visible to people who can get in the proper mental space. They can see and work with those things. And it's like light workers doing healing. They work with the light. All of that's metaphoric, but it helps people make things more concrete so that they can work with it, as opposed to entirely abstract. And we have a hard time working with abstractions. So that's why we have these tools that we use. Chakras are a tool to help people grow up, to help people evolve the quality of their consciousness. And they take something very complicated and complex in abstract space down to something that people can see and they can feel and they can work with it. And it works because it helps focus their intent on the things that make it work.
That's part of our need to be creative, to explain our
It's
experiences,
exactly.
as limited as it is here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Love is the answer. If there's one way to discover this truth that Tom Campbell, physicist and consciousness expert, has concluded, it is through your own experience. Give yourself the gift of experiencing yourself. After all, Tom has stated so many times that if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. So learn to experience with Tom's Exploring Consciousness and Everything Paranormal program and unlock those natural abilities for yourself. Discover why love is the answer. Binaural beats included to assist you. Details are in the description below. Thank you.